Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am MancBasTurd and I've got another video for you today. Now, back in the early days of gaming, wrestling games were one of the earliest examples of one-on-one fighting games. Moving into the N64 and PlayStation 1 eras, they provided those consoles with some of the best multiplayer experiences that could be had. With WWE 2K22 on the horizon, I thought it would be a good idea to celebrate the storied history of wrestling in video games. Before I do though, if you're new to the channel, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button, ring the bell to make sure that you receive alerts and notifications of new content as and when it becomes available on the channel. Now, without further ado, here are the 10 best professional wrestling video games of all time. At their core, wrestling games are fighting games, but perhaps no game embraced the fighting game aspect quite as heavily as Saturday Night Slam Masters. Developed by Capcom, Saturday Night Slam Masters was shallow fun with awesome looking characters designed by Tetsuo Hara of Fist of the North Star fame. It also incorporated wrestling quite nicely with short character entrances, a count-out victory condition, and the ability to utilise attacks from the top rope. The Fire Pro Wrestling series has a storied history dating all the way back to 1989, but its latest iteration, Fire Pro Wrestling World, is easily the best version to date. The relationship between Fire Pro Wrestling and other wrestling games has always had a Coke or Pepsi kind of feel to it, where wrestling fans largely preferred either one to the other due to Fire Pro Wrestling's unique control scheme and iconic isometric camera angle. It's not everyone's cup of tea. But Fire Pro Wrestling World's deep library of wrestling moves and created wrestlers is undeniably impressive, and it makes it worthy of a spot on the list. Wrestling is at its best when it embraces and reveals its absurdity, and no wrestling game did that better than WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game. Developed by the makers of NBA Jam, WWF Wrestlemania the arcade game essentially did for wrestling what NBA Jam did for basketball. Undertaker would bust out gravestones to beat people over the head with, Razor Ramon could turn his arm into a literal razor, and Doink the Clown would attack with hand butters comically oversized mallets. It was ridiculous arcade fun, and always a great spot to spend 25 cents in an arcade back in the 90s. AKI Corporation is a legend in the wrestling video game world, as you'll quickly learn via this list. And while WrestleMania 2000 isn't their best game, or their first game, it was the first time the developer was able to show what they were able to do with the WWF roster during a time where wrestling was at its peak, the Attitude Era. WrestleMania 2000 took the foundation of everything that was laid down in WCW vs NWO World Tour and Revenge and refined it, resulting in one of the best video games for the N64. Sometimes in the world of anime games, there's just a perfect matching of developer with anime property. It happened with Arc System Works and Dragon Ball Z with Dragon Ball FighterZ, and it also happened with Kinnikuman, also known in the US as Ultimate Muscle, and AKI Corporation. Ultimate Muscle Legends vs New Generation is the perfect blend of wrestling and fantasy, featuring a combination of real-life wrestling holds, out-of-this-world super moves, and that tried and true AKI style of wrestling gameplay that centres around punches, grapples, and reversal. Also, there's Dick Van Dyke, which is just a fun thing to say. The WWE 2K series have been on such a downward trend over the last few years that it can be pretty hard to remember the good times. The good times actually were pretty great. WWE 2K14 marked the pinnacle of the series, as it was the wrestling swan song of the PS3 and Xbox 360 era, and contained years of iterations and improvements to the formula, culminating in one of the best and traditional wrestling games of all time. Then, WWE 2K15 stumbled through the wall like the Shockmaster, and 2K has still been trying to put everything back together, but that's beside the point. WWE 2K14 was peak WWE 2K, with a fantastic 30 years of WrestleMania mode, a plethora of match types, fantastic roster, and genuinely solid wrestling gameplay. An underrated gem, WWE AllStars is quite simply the best arcade wrestling game there's ever been. Developed by THQ San Diego and led by creative director Sal DeVita, who also worked on WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game. WWE AllStars let go any notion of realism or simulation and focused on the fun of wrestling, and the result was, shocker, a ridiculously fun wrestling game. But more than that, it was also a smartly designed fighting game as well, with some of the coolest wrestling super moves that you've ever seen. SmackDown Here Comes the Pain is similar to WWE 2K14 in that it was kind of the culmination of years of improvements and represented the SmackDown series when it was at its best. The developer Ukes decided to change things up with SmackDown vs Raw, which was its own sub-series, but Here Comes the Pain will always be remembered as the peak of the core SmackDown line of games. Its fighting was fast-paced and incredibly satisfying, the game's dynamic use of camera angles heightened the excitement of each move, there was an insane number of match types, you could throw weapons, you could stack tables, you could stack ladders on tables, and overall the game hit a perfect blend of simplicity and depth that wasn't quite matched in years later on in the series. Def Jam Fight for New York represented perhaps the biggest departure from AKI's bread and butter combat system, but despite a greater focus on strikes and environmental interactables, Def Jam Fight for New York is still undeniably a wrestling game, albeit one that trades in the spandex superheroes of the wrestling ring for hip-hop stars like Redman, Method Man and Snoop Dogg. Fight for New York was actually the second Def Jam wrestling game from AKI, and while the first game, Def Jam Vendetta, wasn't bad by any stretch, Fight for New York's simplicity improves upon it in every way. It still holds up to this day, and if there's any justice in the world, one day we'll see it again in another form. Now, what's so wonderful about WWF No Mercy is that despite everything it lacks in comparison to modern wrestling games, from commentary to flashy entrances to Titantron videos that sometimes look like scrambled porn, its fundamentals are so strong that it still holds up in the one area that matters most: gameplay. No Mercy simply feels amazing to play. On top of its stellar gameplay, No Mercy was also simply one of the most fully featured wrestling games on the market. It had a great story mode that branched like a visual novel depending on your wins or losses, an exhaustive creative wrestler mode, and an excellent roster consisting of just about every notable wrestler from the Attitude Era. No Mercy was the total package, and it helped cement the N64's legacy of one of the best consoles for wrestling games. Now, do you agree with my list of top 10 best wrestling games of all time? Which games didn't make the list but you think should have? Let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed watching the video, elbow drop a like and share it with your friends. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Cheers.